Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm David Myers, your host for today's episode and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, which sponsors the podcast. I'm excited to welcome to the show Michael Sfard, who is widely renowned as one of Israel's leading human rights lawyers. Michael is also a dedicated activist and accomplished author who published a book about his work in 2018 called The Wall and the Gate: Israel, Palestine, and the Legal Battle for Human Rights. So let's set the stage. Israel is in the throes of a profound crisis of democracy. Along with other regimes around the world, such as Hungary and Poland, the Netanyahu government has advanced a huge number of legislative proposals designed to dilute the power of the judiciary and thereby eliminate an important check on its proposed transformation of Israel. One of these bills, which was discussed by the Supreme Court this week on September 12th, was a proposal to strip away a key element of the court's authority itself by refusing to allow the court to void government actions that it deemed extremely unreasonable. Meanwhile, the protest movement, which has gathered hundreds of thousands of Israelis for a remarkable 36 weeks in a row, has mobilized to defend the judiciary and especially the Supreme Court. There are few better guides to make sense of what's going on in Israel and what the Supreme Court represents than Michael Sfard. He not only litigates frequently there, but he has a uniquely informed and critical perspective on the court's blind spots and on the limitations of law and human rights to effect change. I should add that Michael Sfard is not only a lawyer and activist, he is also a thinker. He comes by it naturally as the child of two professors and the grandson of the great Polish-British sociologist Zygumt Bauman, whose ideas figure in Michael's work. So let's jump right in, Michael. The crisis of democracy in which Israel finds itself today was not born the day after Benjamin Netanyahu was reelected on November 1st, 2022. So can you help us understand the roots of that crisis? How far back do you see it going?
You know, I've been thinking about this question myself for the last more than 6 months and 7 months. And the more I think about it, the deeper I go in the archaeology of looking for the roots of it. So, you know, you start with saying, yes, the most timid answer would be a bunch of bad guys won the election this way or another, and that's the reason. But of course it's not. And the more you think about it, then you go back to some founding issues or founding characteristics of Israeli society, and you discover that that this government, which is a very bad government and in a league of its own in being vicious, but it's not completely an anomaly. In some ways, it continues, of course, with a much more both in quantity and quality, it goes farther away from any other government in history. But some of the directions that it took are a continuation of things we had in the past. So if we look at the endless occupation that Israel engages in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip since 1967, so this is a source of constant stream of authoritarianism and basically a dictatorship that we impose on millions of people. If we look even before the occupation, and we remind ourselves that the Israeli-Palestinian minority, the Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel and are more than fifth of the Israeli society, have been under military rule for 19 years since the establishment of the state in 1948. As citizens, they were put under military regime that ended only in 1966. When we look at the DNA of what what composes the structure and the guiding values of the Israeli society, we can, I think, discover that there is a gene, one of the genes, that could have remained inactive, but did not. That we can track the current grab of power by the executive and the drive to implement Jewish supremacy between the Jordan River and the sea. We can track it back to 1948. And when we talk about 1948, we have to go back to the Second World War and 2,000 years of persecution. And I'll stop here because we are getting to the...
Well, you're getting to the heart of the matter, the phenomenon of trauma and its profound effects on Jewish and Israeli political thinking. But I wonder, in light of what you said about the gene, which could have remained dormant, when you engage in the kind of reflection that you alluded to at the outset, how much of an historical determinist are you? I mean, how much do you think that we are today where, in some sense, we could only be, that this is the inevitable result of a state that defined itself as Jewish? What does the counterfactual look like for you? What could have allowed a deviation from the course that was taken? What was the road that wasn't taken, and how realistic was that?
Well, it's the most risky game of all, to play what if and alternative history. History took a certain route, and that's what we have. We don't have an alternative reality. But I choose not to be determinist. I think it's important for people who are striving for social change, and people who are feel strongly about ethics and morality, to believe that people have a choice. People, not only individuals, but also peoples, groups, collectives. And the other route that could have been taken was to try and solve the Jewish problem and create a homeland for the Jewish people that would not be a political entity with such exclusivity to the Jewish people. The alternative could have been acknowledging that there is another people that is living in the piece of land where the Jewish homeland is being established, and respecting the rights of those who live here. Now, is it a dream? A fantasy? I don't know, because we didn't go that way. But we still have the chance to divert the track to that direction.
Yeah. Now, defenders of the state will point to the 13th paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which talks about full equal rights for all citizens. Therein lies, I suppose, an urtext, a textual base for that vision that you just articulated. But how do you understand that paragraph in the context of the whole document, and how essential is it for serving as a basis for your work as a human rights lawyer?
I am suspicious of that document, because that document was written and signed in the middle of the most dramatic ethnic cleansing project that has taken in this land for many years, and which the Palestinians, the Palestinian people, is still being affected by it in a tremendous way. So it's, I believe that this paragraph was written with a conviction that the state that is being established may and should provide some guarantees for individual rights, but not for collective rights to non-Jews. And we know today that human beings are not only individuals. Of course, they are individuals. And it's a very important thing that they are individuals. But they're also part of family and a community and a people. And all of these identity sources need to be cultivated and need to be supported in order for people to materialize their humanity. And I don't believe that the Declaration of Independence and even that paragraph 13 was set to provide anything but individual rights, which it did, and we today even have to struggle to implement even that.
Yeah, and we should note that it was also drafted to meet the specifications of the United Nations in order to assure Israel's admission to the United Nations as a formal matter.
And as an implementation of the partition plan, which called for liberal democracies to be established here.
Exactly. We're going to turn back to 1967. You've made an argument for sort of the longue durée perspective on the roots of the crisis. But I want to see if we can figure out what the impact of the Netanyahu era has been. Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister for a second time in 2009 and has essentially been in control since then, from 2009 until the present, with the exception of 1 year. How do you assess the Netanyahu era, especially in terms of what you're concerned about, Israel, the rule of law, and human rights?
Well, one has to acknowledge that even ethnocracies, governments who are made of and for a certain ethnicity, and are chronically and systematically oppressing or discriminating, or both, other ethnicities, even they want to be seen as democracies. And for that aim and for the benefits that are associated with being a member of this exclusive club of democracies, even ethnocracies are willing to pay a certain price, a certain tax in terms of rights. So, and I call it the liberal crack. So, countries that are, or governments that are not really liberal, not convicted, they're not convinced that liberalism is their way of their founding philosophy, and yet they're willing to pay a certain price to be seen as liberals. Liberal in the general sense, not in the American sense. I know that the word has different meanings, but so Israel was established on several ideas: pluralism, separation of powers, freedom of the press and freedom of speech in general, the independence of the judiciary, and all kinds of mechanisms, some strong, some very weak for balance of power. What happened in the Netanyahu eras was that the governments under his leadership have begun to be less and less willing to pay the price that is associated with being seen as a liberal democracy. And we've seen that at first with targeting civil society. Civil society is the first to be targeted because it's the weakest link. It's easier to target human rights organizations who are criticizing the government abroad, who are criticizing our troops, than to first choose the judiciary as the target of attack, because the judiciary has power, has governmental power, and they can issue rulings. So we've seen how it went from civil society to the academia to the press to the arts, and finally now we're with the judiciary. Every year with Netanyahu, we have peeled another layer of the cosmetics of democracy. It's not just cosmetics. It's values that actually work because Israel was willing to provide that space in order to be member of the club. Netanyahu, like other populist leaders, have made a conclusion that it's not worth it. He wants power, absolute power, he and his cronies, and even if that means that Israel would not be seen as a democracy anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to note that a colleague and friend, Viktor Orban, was reelected Prime Minister of Hungary in 2010. He had been Prime Minister before, also with a somewhat more moderate agenda. And we can almost track in parallel the return to power of these two politicians who share a similar commitment, it seems, to what Orban famous or infamously called illiberal democracy.
Yes.
On that note, I want to now tack back a little bit to what we passed over just a minute ago, which is 1967. And I want to do so by calling to our attention a report that you wrote for the Israeli human rights organization Yesh Din in 2020. That's made a very compelling case on the basis of an analysis of international law that Israel's control of the West Bank can be called a regime of apartheid. So can you just briefly summarize how you arrived at that conclusion?
Of course, it's interesting to note that today, when this conversation is being recorded, the former head of the Mossad, Tamir Predo, gave an interview to AP saying more or less the same thing. So that Israel is imposing an apartheid regime on the West Bank.
We live in a strange world, Micha. We live in a strange world in which the military and intelligence leaders, or the former ones, are sort of the rational actors and the ones who seem to speak truth to power.
It's really unbelievable that those who fight for democracy are relying on military and even secret police generals to be on their side. But nothing is normal or regular in Israel. Anyway, the report that I wrote was a product of years of frustration. The frustration by members of Yesh Din, volunteers who are spending a lot of time in the West Bank, in villages, providing assistance to Palestinian villagers and residents of towns and cities to file complaints against military personnel or settlers, mainly settlers, who have been attacking them, abusing them, and causing damage to their property. And what we've seen by being in the West Bank for so long was not, I mean, the paradigm of occupation, which definitely there is an occupation there, but the paradigm of occupation was not wide enough. Its shoulders could not carry the full weight of the beast that we saw there. And for me, as a lawyer and a human rights lawyer, it was very important to put the reality that I experience in the correct legal terminology. So occupation definitely explains some things, but not all of them. It doesn't explain the reality in which you have settlers colonizing that territory. They are citizens of the state that occupies that territory. They have full civil and political rights as accorded in a modern democracy, and their neighbors, the indigenous Palestinians, are stripped of their rights for the duration of the occupation, which becomes permanent. And all the resources of the land are being diverted from the Palestinians to the settlers. So how do you call that thing? It's not just an occupation. And of course, the first thing that came to mind is the international crime of apartheid, which originally comes from the experience of Southern Africa, but it is today an independent legal institution. And the definition of which, in very rough terms, is a regime that in which one group of people dominates and oppresses systematically another group of people. It is committing inhuman acts, carrying out inhuman acts against these people, and with the intention of maintaining their inferiority and maintaining the superiority of the dominating group. And this is exactly what there is definitely in the West Bank. Some organizations, human rights organizations, have made a resolution that the apartheid extends to more than the West Bank. I did not look into other areas. For me, the system in the West Bank is a system of apartheid, and unfortunately, embarrassing and sadly for me as an Israeli, Israelis are committing this crime against humanity.
And what red lines, as it were, since the green line has been crossed, what red line has to be crossed for you to make the determination that apartheid is not restricted to the West Bank? What would that look like, through the lens of your legal analysis?
So, apartheid is a crime that is closely associated to a system of government, so to a regime. In one of the discussions I have with my Palestinian and international colleagues who have dissected the question in a geographic scope of between the river and the sea, is the question of how many regimes do we have between the Jordan River and the sea. There's definitely one political power that dominates all the area, and that's the government of Israel. But is the government of Israel responsible for one or for two systems of government, or maybe more than two? And for me, as a system of government or a regime is a combination of a normative framework, a legal system, with institutions capable of implementing those norms, and with policies and practices that they carry out. Now, I wrote already in 2020 in my report that I think there are two regimes here. There are two systems, normative systems. There are two distinct institutions. But clearly, there is a process of unification going on. And I even gave the metaphor of two, stars. One sheds matter over the other. So at a certain point, any spectator would say, well, it's one entity already. You can't talk about two objects up in the sky. Have we reached that point? Maybe. We're very close, definitely, to that. That's one question. The second question is how profound and how systematic and should need a discrimination of a certain class B in order for that to reach the classification of apartheid. So if we speak about apartheid within Israel, within the Green Line, towards the Palestinian minority of civilians in Israel, the question is it a key feature of the regime? Is the regime all set to make that to coerce that inferiority? I'm an Israeli, and I was born in Israel. I'm Jewish. Maybe I'm biased. I think that it's not enough when you have a community that have the right to vote and to be elected. Yes, they are being not just discriminated against, but their political power is being diluted and delegitimized, etc., and all of these things. But I don't think it's enough to say that the crime of apartheid is being committed within Israel.
Okay. Let's turn now to the institution that stands at the center of so much public attention today, the Supreme Court of Israel, which also functions as the High Court of Justice. Indeed, it's that institution that many have taken to the streets on a weekly basis now for 35 consecutive weeks to defend, which is seen in their eyes as the paragon of democracy and the protector of civil and human rights. You, by contrast, especially in your writings and in your important book, The Wall and the Gate, see the High Court of Justice as a compromised institution, a deeply compromised institution, one that has participated in perpetuating the occupation and the deep injustice that issues from it. So what I'd love to hear from you, based both on your experience at the court and also your understanding of its history, did it ever operate differently? Was it ever a paragon of justice? That is to say, before the occupation, was it a different kind of institution? And did the occupation transform it into an instrument of that very oppression which the occupation represents in your perspective?
I looked for a long time for the right way to describe the complexity of the Israeli Supreme Court's record. And eventually I reached the following conclusion. We shouldn't divide the court's record to before and after the occupation. We should divide it thematically to the occupation and inside Israel. We are witnessing the judicial Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We have one institution that in the same building with the same individuals who serve as justices, and they have completely different record when they are ruling on matters that pertain to rights of Israelis and the questions that are, LGBTQI rights and freedom from coercion, religious coercion, and pluralism in the arts, and and all of the and
Speaking principally of Israeli Jews, yes?
speaking principally of Israeli Jews, speaking principally of the balance of power between the executive and other and individuals and other and the press, for example. We have, an alien that would only read the law books in which the cases that are dealing with these issues would say this is an exemplary liberal human rights protecting institution. But then we will take out the other books that are not being translated to English by the court. And I had this fantasy once to find the budget to issue a book that would be called The Rulings of the Israeli Supreme Court, which were not translated by it. And that other book, that secret book, involves the things that stain the judiciary, will stain it forever. No due process whatsoever for Palestinians. Collective punishment were koshered by the court. Thousands of deportations who are clearly illegal by international law were allowed by the court. The whole settlement enterprise was facilitated, which is an affront to international law, which is a violation of the most basic tenets of the post-Second World War international law-based order. And so we have two courts. And now this cannot be, just like with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this cannot be, it is not sustainable, this split personality. And that's what we're seeing.
Well, you, in some sense, are a byproduct of that court. You are, in some sense, a split personality, insofar as you are one of the most well-known and effective human rights lawyers in Israel who spends much time litigating at the Supreme Court, at the High Court of Justice. And yet you have stated in a moment of very great self-reflection in your book, The Wall and the Gate, we've actually posed this question: am I a pawn in the greatest swindle of the Israeli occupation by helping to prop up the illusion of a regime that has mechanisms and laws in place to prevent arbitrary acts, contain state violence, and thwart injustice? So that kind of, do you see yourself as a split personality, or how do you imagine your own role in this ecosystem?
Yes, I think there is a barter here. There is a barter. The court asks me to provide some sense of legitimacy and an aura of legalism and absence of arbitrariness. And in exchange, they swingle above me remedy for my clients. And that remedy, for the listeners, who it's not 1,000 shekels here or there. It can be family unification, a husband that could continue to live with his wife or children. It could be saving your olive grove, which is the only source of livelihood for someone. It could be torture. It could be the stopping of the outlawing of torture use in investigations. It can be many things that for individuals are their whole life. So my belly aches, the questions that I ask myself at a certain stage: should I not do that barter? Should I not engage in this dirty business exchange? I don't have these bellyaches anymore. I came to terms with what I do because I believe that if I am a human rights lawyer and if I cherish the well-being of people more than anything else. And if those people come to me and ask me to represent them, me, the one that is privileged, the one that is a member of the superior group, then I will not be the one that will tell them you have to sacrifice your livelihood or your family life or any other part of your well-being for the greater cause. And what I do instead, I try to mitigate this toll of legitimacy by writing books, op-eds, and being interviewed for podcasts. And then I try to tell people, look, you see me there, that's true. It doesn't mean that I think this court is okay, is a good court.
Yeah, I mean, we should note that you fall in a long line of distinguished predecessors, including Felicia Lange, Matt Semmel, Avigdor Feldman, who grappled with this question. And in fact, in your book, one of the most interesting chapters or episodes that you describe is this convening of human rights lawyers beginning a little over 15 years ago in 2007 to really try to address this question. Are we abetting the system by representing our clients in these courts? And in one of the most interesting moments, you describe yet another one of these former military leaders, a former general, Ilan Paz, who had the chutzpah to say, without you, without human rights organization, there is no occupation. The system can't function a single day without you. I'm just wondering, in light of that, what do you make? I mean, you've sort of answered it, but it's kind of another angle. What do you make of the critique of the project of human rights? The critique that says human rights is really an extension of a kind of colonial regime that seeks to whitewash the deep structures of inequity while attending to sort of the individual instances that it can sort of live without.
Well, first I want to say that Ilan Paz made that remark in what we should call today a different world, because what he meant was that without us, there'll be such a humanitarian crisis that no one will accept, something will have to change. The government would not accept, and foreign governments would not accept such a humanitarian crisis. I'm not sure that this is the case today. I'm not sure that such a humanitarian crisis would cause a big crisis, political crisis. I think I know and I appreciate the criticism of the human rights project, and I have to say that there is a lot of wisdom in that critique. But that critique has two failures. One is to sanctify human beings. Eventually, at the end of the day, there is a human being. And the chapter you referred to in my book, after the episode with Ilan Paz, I go on and I describe an imaginary conversation between an imaginary lawyer and an imaginary client. And the lawyer explains to the client why he wouldn't take his case, even though there is a chance of alleviating the client's suffering, because of exactly what Ilan Paz says and what the critique goes. So that means we need to sacrifice individual human beings on the altar of a speculation that this will make everything much better in the long run. This is a position that a humanist cannot accept. That's one failure. The second failure is that even within the constraints of the human rights system, one can strategize and find ways how to both serve the client and serve the goal of weakening wicked regimes. And this is what I do, or try to do, all my life. It's not just representing clients and trying to get a remedy for them. It's strategizing with human rights organizations and with other protest groups in a way to tackle the weak points of the regime and try to make the reality unstable. And I think we do it from time to time. When we managed to get the High Court to rule that Amona outpost or Migron outpost, where the aristocracy of the mainstream of the settlement movement live, has to be dismantled. And those hundreds of people have to be taken out because this is private property that belongs to Palestinians. That created a huge political crisis. And brought about many things, including eventually it had an effect on Security Council Resolution 2334 from December of 2016, when the government tried to expropriate the land by law, which again, it failed because we managed to win a constitutional case against it. So while we have constraint, and the constraints are our ethical commitment to human rights, we can still maneuver and try to use these cases in order to challenge the system.
Right. So it seems to me that your humanist and incrementalist approach is the product of many years of working in the system and a good deal of reflection about whether or not you're playing a role that assists or, in fact, seeks to undermine a regime of injustice. But there's another part of your being that is perhaps less known and that I'd like to talk about in this final segment of our conversation. And that is the fact that you are the grandson of a great scholar, the great Polish, Jewish, British scholar, Zygumt Bauman, who, to my reckoning, belongs to really that great tradition of Central and East Central European, Eastern European Jewish scholars who offered a very serious critique of the project of enlightenment and modernity, and particularly the notion that that rationality necessarily led to more progressive or better results. These intellectuals, Horkheimer and Adorno, and Dialectic of Enlightenment, Hannah Arendt, Salah Baron, all called attention to the fact that, in fact, it's in the modern age that the rationalist state engaged in some of the most heinous and murderous acts of any period in history. One of your grandfather's most renowned works is his book from 1989, Modernity and the Holocaust. And there he offers the view, consistent with Horkheimer, Adorno, and others, that the Holocaust was not a deviation from the Enlightenment or from the rationalist project of modernity, but a byproduct of it. And he spends a good deal of time making that case. He draws upon the famous kind of idiosyncratic essay of the German Jewish scholar Georg Simmel on the stranger. And I'm just wondering how you relate to Bauman's work, in terms of your own sense of personal and professional identity. How influential was it in your formation? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your encounter with your grandfather.
Well, my grandfather was, first and foremost, my grandfather. So, you call him Professor Zygumt Bauman, I called him Jaja. And we had lots of conversations. And, I like to tell people that when grandchildren go visit their grandparents, the grandparents ask, so what do young people do today? And my grandfather was not asking me this. He would explain to me why we do what we do, the young generation. So we had a lot of conversations, and I, of course, read a lot of his work, and it was influential. It was influential in the formation of my ethical being, my moral being. I think his work on modernity, but also on postmodernity, by the way, has been a project of creating doubt and suspicion, and helping people realize that there are no magic tricks and that would lead to happiness and well-being. That this is hard work, and that we need to ask ourselves every day if what we do is the right thing. And we have to ask ourselves moral questions all the time, and we cannot be just guided by this magical formula that if, like science or progression or progress or things like that. So his work definitely on the Holocaust and on the curse of the survivor has been of a tremendous influence on me and on allowing me to understand better the community that I live in and the different ways that people think about the reality, about what they think are enemies or threats. This was and still is a very important part of how I see things.
And I should add that he had particular insight, searing insight, I would say, into the consequences of the trauma of the Holocaust. I'm thinking in particular of his 2002 article, The Holocaust Life as a Ghost, where he talks about hereditary victims of the Holocaust. That is to say, those who are not survivors or descendants of survivors, who nonetheless adopted the mantle of victimhood. And he makes the argument that their memory of suffering can have really deleterious effects on others. He draws the conclusion that that kind of adoption of the mantle of victimhood does not assure, and here I'm quoting, the lifelong dedication to the fight against humanity, but in fact the opposite, the division of humanity into victims and victimizers. So he had real insight into the way in which victims of trauma can become victimizers. And then he brings it closer to the case you know so well, when he asks, where else can one come closer to their dreams, referring to these hereditary victims, than among the famished and destitute, despaired and desperate, cursing and stone-throwing Palestinians. So in some way, you seem to be inheriting the mantle as critic, but also adding the role of activist to your grandfather's intellectual legacy. And I'm wondering if that speaks to you.
Well, first of all, it's a big compliment. Thank you. I want to be that. I mean, I think it's a very profound analysis. He says in the same article that you referred to, he says that we mention and justifiably a lot that violence breeds more violence, but we do not mention enough that victimhood breeds more victims. This is exactly, before I read that article, I had my own non-professional, non-expert explanation of the kind of fixation or obsession that the Israeli society has with annihilation. And with, again, one can understand why a people that went through the most systematic and industrialized genocide are fixated with the threat that Holocaust is always across the corner. But I remember thinking to myself that we have a very binary vision of reality, that people can either be victims or victimizers. These are the only two options. It's like someone who is always been bullied at school and gets to the conclusion that children at school are either bullies or victims of bullies. And when you have this vision, then you are very close to the decision that I am afraid my society has taken, to be victimizers, not victims, because we've been victims long enough. And that means that by whatever the price is, we will not be victims. Now, with that, the hereditary survival syndrome, and the hereditary is sometimes imagined. It's not that not even my parents were in the concentration camps, not my grandparents, not even my neighbor's grandparents, but I am I'm a child of the Holocaust, as member of my community, as someone that is being told that I am that is being taken to to Poland to see concentration camps, that is being educated that I am a child of Holocaust survivors. As such, I see the Holocaust, in every Palestinian young person who's throwing stones on a armored jeep of the most strong army in the Middle East. That young Palestinian who throws stones, there is some continuity between him and Hitler. And when that is your state of mind, when there is always a Holocaust around the corner, and when all of your enemies are always conspiring to annihilate you cannot really run a normal society like that. You end up doing kind of things that we do. And the only cure for that, as my grandfather wrote, the title was The Holocaust Life as a Ghost. So we need the Ghostbusters. We need a system that would shoo away the ghosts. And you can only do it through awareness. When we are aware of this, when we are aware of these processes, that's the only way to tackle them. I can go on forever, so I'll stop here.
Okay, I want to ask you, in light of that response, and as a final question, in thinking of the space on the spectrum between victim and victimizer, it's a big question to conclude with, how you see the present moment. Because on one hand, it's a moment of increasing authoritarianism as manifested by the most right-wing government in Israeli history. On the other hand, it is a moment of the greatest political awakening, as reflected in the fact that estimates are 6 to 7 million Israelis have taken to the streets for 35 consecutive weeks, the likes of which we have not seen. So, as a concluding question, Michal, how do you see this current moment? Do you see it as a window of opportunity to create that space between victim and victimizer?
That I must see it as an opportunity. This is not just an opportunity, but a challenge. We are seeing something we've never seen, not only never seen in the Israeli society, no one ever have anticipated anything remotely like that. We're seeing that the Israeli society has strength and energy and persistence that no expert of the Israeli society would have ever guessed they have. The sleeping Israeli giant woke up, and not just woke up and it is fighting back. Yes, for its own rights, not for the rights of others. But that's fine. That's how good revolutions are done. When people are going out to the streets to fight for their own rights. This is the French Revolution. That was the American Revolution. That's how good revolutions are happening, to make sure that people's rights are respected. But at the same time, when people are fighting for their human basic rights and are fighting for democratic values, they open up, their minds open up. They start seeing things they haven't seen before. Now, it is not very difficult to see that 15, 20 minutes drive from where people are gathering and chanting democracy, democracy, all the things that they are fighting against have already occurred. There's no separation of powers. There is no basic human rights of minority. There is no independent judiciary. All of these are happening when you don't have traffic jams. They're 15 minutes away from Tel Aviv. Now, what we're seeing is indeed that people in the center of the political spectrum are, for the not first time, but for the first time in many, many years, are interested, are being politicized. When I say being politicized, I mean that they are starting to think of different questions in terms of political power and interests that collide. And that is a challenge for my friends and for me, for the camp that I belong to show them, to provide them with the political education. It's a bad word, political education, but with the information and with the ideas, and convince them that it's not enough that the Israeli Supreme Court will remain intact. It's not enough that Netanyahu will not consolidate power. It's not enough until as long as we continue to oppress other people, we cannot be a democracy. And we have to do it. This is a chance. I don't know how long it will be before all the stars would align as they have been now, especially when people are seeing that many of the ideas for the constitutional revolution are made in the settlements. They come with a sticker, made in settlements, in Kiryat Arba, where Ben Gvir lives, in Kdumim, where Smotrich lives, in Pnei Hever, where Rotman lives. These are things that come from those areas. And all I can say is it is a moment of opportunity and challenge.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Michael Sfard, distinguished lawyer, human rights activist, author, grandson of Zygumt Bauman, for making time out of your busy schedule to talk with us on Then and Now. It's really been a pleasure.
It was great. Thank you very much for inviting me, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.